Hello everyone, welcome back. It's part 2 in a 2-part series of videos I'm making about student visas in New Zealand. As some of you may know, my name is David. I'm a lawyer. I'm based in New Zealand, and we specialize in immigration matters and related other matters as well, relating to migrants and migrant issues. But today's video is going to be all about information related to student visas. Now, part 1, if you want to go back and have a look at that, I'm giving some core understandings about student visas, how they work, some advice about what you should be thinking about when you're applying. And in this video, I'm going to go through some questions that we get, some common questions, and I'm just going to answer these questions in the way that I would normally answer if they came to me as a client. And so hopefully you get some value from this. And if any of you want any specific questions to be answered in the next video, please feel free to put it down in the comments or get in touch with us. All right. So the first question in my list to answer is the question, can my uncle or friend sponsor me for my student visa in New Zealand? So as you'll all be aware, there's a financial aspect to a student visa application, and you need to show that you have sufficient funds to support yourself, to pay for the studies. And so people often ask, can my family member or friend sponsor me? Now the simple and clear answer is yes. Okay, but as with any simple answer, there's always a caveat or a warning behind that, because what immigration will be looking at is whether the sponsorship makes sense, whether it's logical. Okay, they want to know what is the relationship that you have with the sponsor. Obviously, is there any kind of financial or other incentive behind them sponsoring you? Does it make sense why they're willing to support you? And also, can they demonstrate what's their source of funds and where that comes from? Obviously, parents are the main common one that we see, and this is very logical and very normal. Occasionally, some people will use a close friend or family member that they have in New Zealand already, and this is also okay. One thing to keep in mind, this is something that not everybody knows, is that if somebody sponsors you for your first student visa in New Zealand, that person is the only one who can then sponsor you in the future for further student visas, or further visas. Generally speaking, if you stay in New Zealand and you apply for another visa in the future, you can only use a sponsor if that sponsor was your initial sponsor for the first one. That's a detail that you can look into if you're going ahead with an application. But anyway, the short answer is yes, your family can support you, but if the family member or friend cannot demonstrate that it makes logical sense why they're doing so, immigration may have a problem with that. Okay, the next question to answer is family applications. Do we apply together or separate? So in this scenario, very often we have a couple, maybe it's a husband and a wife, and one of them wants to be the student, and then the other one will be coming in as a partner or a dependent. And in some cases, there are also children who may or may not be eligible for domestic student visa status to go to school, or visitor visas, etc. And so people often ask, okay, well, what's the best way to do this? Do we lodge it all together all at once, or shall I do the student visa application first and then the family later? And we see various opinions in the industry about what's the right way to do this. Sometimes we find that education agents or advisors from offshore will suggest to someone, hey, look, you should just apply for your own student visa first, because if you apply all together, immigration might think that you're migrating for some different purpose and they might decline you. And this may or may not be true. I think in most cases it doesn't come down to that. It would come down to the whole picture of everything. Our advice usually comes down to, or usually hinges upon, whether we see any risk of an application being declined or having difficulty. In other words, if you're applying as a student and you've got a partner and children, and if your application is reasonably straightforward, you come from a reasonably clear background, a good country with a good passport, we don't really see much risk in the application having trouble or being declined. Well, in that type of situation, we might say, look, it makes sense to just lodge it all together because you save time. Potentially you save money, because if you're paying a lawyer or an advisor, they might actually have to charge you more if you do the application separately. Whereas if you do them together as a bundle, we all save time. And of course you save the hassle of having to lodge one and then waiting for it, and then lodge the other ones and waiting for them later, maybe to do with timing of when the study begins, etc., etc. So the other flip side of that is, of course, if we identify some potential risk, like maybe your application isn't so straightforward and maybe there's a chance that it might not work, well, in that case, sure, go ahead and lodge the main applicant first, wait for that approval, and once you've got that approval in hand, then it's a lot easier and to feel confident to apply for the family. Okay, next question. And this is something that we do see a lot for student visas, especially cases that we work with. The question is, hey, look, I'm not so young anymore. I'm a bit advanced in age. Will my age affect my application? So, again, talking about the short answer, in this case, the short answer is yes, it can affect, but it affects not necessarily automatically negatively, okay? It affects your application in a sense that it forms the basis of the landscape, so to speak, of what you're presenting and who you are, your profile. And so immigration will be looking at that. They'll be looking at your age in the context of everything else that forms your application basis. And this is the same for any aspect, everything's just seen in context. So a good immigration lawyer or an advisor will talk to you up front about what this means, what age means, and how it impacts the application. And how it impacts most applications is not simply because of the age, it's what the age means. For example, and I mentioned this in the first part of this series, we talked about how somebody may have completed a bachelor degree in their early years, but then they go ahead and get married and stay home as a housewife for 20 years. And then, of course, once the children grow up and move on in life, they make the decision to come back to the workforce, and it would make sense to retrain. So in the context of that person's story, the study makes sense for an older person, even with a 20-year gap in between previous studies. Whereas someone else may let's say it's not a housewife, maybe let's just say it's a career person who doesn't have children. They've followed their career, they've spent their life doing one pathway of their career, and now all of a sudden at the age of 40 they're applying to go to New Zealand to study, and maybe they're trying to study a course that doesn't match anything to do with their background. Maybe they've been working in banks all their life and they were a bank manager for 15 years, and then they've applied to study cookery or to be a home caregiver in New Zealand. These things don't naturally align, and so what immigration is looking at in this case is not necessarily because you're older that it's a problem, but it's because you're older and you've spent your entire life going down this pathway, and then suddenly you want to jump over here to some new pathway which kind of just appears like you might be using it to just maybe get residence or a visa or something, and doesn't necessarily fit into your let's just say like the landscape or your life's circumstances. So in cases like that, how do you get around it? Well, we need to present your case well. We need to convince immigration that you've got a genuine reason for changing your pathway and for having a long period of time in between previous studies and now, and maybe explaining and here's an example of how it might sound. Hey, look, I spent my career working in banks. I have a bachelor degree in commerce because when I graduated high school, I was good at mathematics and science, and my parents wanted me to get a good bachelor degree. They sent me to the local university. They paid for everything. I couldn't say no. I wasn't really keen on it. I really like cooking, and I really like, maybe caregiving or whatever, other things, but I couldn't really do it. So I followed my career in the banking system, and I built up my career. I bought a house, and now here I am. I'm in my mid-40s. And I realized that actually I'm not so happy in my life, and I've saved up some money, so I've decided now finally I can follow my passion, and my passion is that I'd like to open my own restaurant. And so therefore I want to learn about international cuisine, and we don't need to go on. I think you get the picture. The point is that we have to present the story in a way that immigration officer can understand why you are going back to study at that advanced age. So I hope that makes sense. That's essentially how we look at it. We look at it in a practical way. And look, in line with that, one thing you could do is you could make a list of the things that could potentially be a concern, and see if you can find ways to address them yourself before applying. What is still possible at your age? What do you like to do? What pathways could still work? If you're thinking about finding a pathway towards residence, okay, and you're going to change your tack and go back to study as an older student, what career could you go into that's not going to take you 10 years or 20 years to build your way back up again? These are things to consider. Even is studying in New Zealand even viable? You're going to spend a lot of money. It's a different country. The environment, the work environment. You have to really consider these things. I know myself, being a middle-aged person, you start to feel like you're running out of time in your life, and to start again and study again is a big deal. Okay, next question. How much cash do I need to be able to study in New Zealand? What is a reasonable amount of money to have in my savings, in my back pocket, to be able to study in New Zealand? Now, tied into this, I'm going to provide my answer in sort of two aspects. There's the actual cost of getting to New Zealand, right, and being approved for the visa. And then on the other hand, there's the reasonable cost of living in New Zealand, which has nothing to do with whether or not you can be eligible for the visa, really, but it is a consideration that immigration officers consider, whether you'll be able to actually support yourself in New Zealand. Okay, so first of all, in terms of tuition fees, you can search up any college, university, education provider online. It's very easy. Most universities will publish their fees online, and if they're not published, you can usually find out one way or another for the individual course. But generally speaking, you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars per year in New Zealand studying at that tertiary level. Some lower level courses can be cheaper, but generally speaking, it's in the tens of thousands. It's a little bit cheaper, I suppose, in New Zealand than some other big Western countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, but it's not unheard of still in New Zealand to spend $40,000 to $50,000 on, for example, a master's degree. Okay, so that's generally speaking, the range of fees you're going to be spending on tuition, $25,000 to $45,000 for a course annually, and this is on par with other countries generally. In addition to that, Immigration New Zealand requires you to show that you have $20,000 per year available to you for your maintenance. What does that mean, to be available to you? Okay, well, it can be cash in the bank. And if it's cash in the bank, savings, term deposits, and it's your personal account, your personal name, they would want to see how you got that money. Obviously, if you're a working person, you're going to show your employment agreement. You're going to show perhaps 6 months or more of your savings history, pay slips, to show how you've earned the money and saved the money. If you've come about the money through inheritance, show that. If you've come about it through, maybe the sale of an asset, show that. Or if that money is going to be provided to you by family members and they are supporting you financially, that's also something you would want to demonstrate and show the reasonable connection between the family members. Because that $20,000 doesn't have to be spent. You just have to show that it's there, and you have to demonstrate that the funds are genuinely available to you during the time of your visa. And this is one area where we see some people getting declined on the funds. People will submit a bank statement that shows $20,000, either with no transaction history, so immigration cannot determine whether it's genuine, or with a transaction history that shows large deposits. What counts as a large deposit is going to depend on the context of everything. Obviously, if you don't earn a lot of money, a large deposit could be simply hundreds of dollars. But if $10,000 has showed up in your bank account 2 weeks before lodging the visa application, the immigration officer is likely going to say, well, look, I can't be satisfied that this is really yours. It's just shown up out of the blue. You haven't explained it. So any large deposits and any source of that money, you want to explain and demonstrate where it came from, for the purpose of showing that it's genuinely available for you during your studies. The money needs to be genuinely available to you during the time of your studies. Now, in addition to this, I want to make a comment. I want to make a comment about, because on the one hand, this is the technical eligibility, okay? What you need to demonstrate to show that you can meet the requirements of the visa. But on the other hand here, we have, we can call this maybe not legal advice, but big brother advice or Uncle David advice. You know, what do you really need to live in New Zealand? Because obviously I know that a lot of people applying to come to New Zealand are genuinely just wanting to study. You're not going to be necessarily relying on the New Zealand's, you know, let's say labour workforce to try to earn money. But plenty of people are applying to study in New Zealand knowing full well that they're going to have 25 hours per week working rights, and they're expecting to work to earn money to support themselves during the studies. And this is totally fine. You know, it's allowed generally, but how much can you earn in New Zealand, and is it enough to live off while you're studying? And if you are relying on your ability to earn money while you're studying in New Zealand, will you be able to complete your course of studies, or will you be focused on working? Minimum wages in New Zealand are just above $20 an hour. Reasonable working wages for reasonable skilled positions, even in retail and hospitality, you can earn potentially $25 to $30 an hour, sometimes a lot more. A lot of people undertake self-employment while they're studying. They do things like, you know, driving Uber Eats, you know, the gig economy, that type of thing, which is allowed generally on those work visas. But really the thing that I just want to point out is be careful, because if you really are approaching this from a point of view of you're going to be supporting yourself by working, that's when you might have difficulty demonstrating to New Zealand that you have sufficient funds to support yourself. $20,000 in a year, in theory, is enough to live off if you're living in student accommodation and you're eating 2-minute ramen noodles or living with your friends. But you'll likely be relying on working, and New Zealand is not a cheap place. For renting a room or a house, you can spend hundreds of dollars a week. People often get surprised that in New Zealand rent is charged weekly, not monthly. And people from all over the world find out pretty quickly that New Zealand is not a cheap place to live. Even outside the main centres of the cities, it's definitely not a cheap place to live. So anyway, that's something to keep in your mind. The cost of living in New Zealand is not just the application fees, the student fees, and visa fees. Okay, as a piece of final advice to wind it up in this 2-part video, there's just a few key things that I'd summarize by saying. Number 1, do your research early. Get onto it early, don't leave it too long, don't try to apply at the last minute. Number 2, don't rely blindly on a local agent or friends or family who give you their advice. Make sure you look at multiple sources, do your own research, and when in doubt, contact a licensed professional, whether that's a New Zealand immigration advisor or lawyer, somebody who really knows what they're doing. Seeking the legal advice if the background, you know, if you have some complexity relating to your background is also really, really important. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, guys, if you have any questions that you'd like me to talk about in these videos, just put them in the comments. Feel free to follow us on the other channels. We've got TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I'm doing these videos mostly in short form on TikTok a lot these days. But if you put in the comments any specific topics you'd like me to cover, then I'll see if I can do a video on that. And as usual, my advice is to get good advice, and good luck with your application.